Hello everybody, my name is ProfRich and today we're learning English. Today's topic is specifically about learning languages and we're using English to talk about that topic. I hope everyone is doing well today. We have started with a poll in the chat. And the poll says, is English difficult because it's so different from your native language? By this, I mean, is the reason why English is difficult for you because you speak whatever your language is? Do you think English would be easier if you spoke a different language? Would you make different kinds of mistakes if you spoke Japanese or Chinese or French and then you learnt English? What do you think? This idea is often called interference. We call this interference. This is the idea that your native language interferes with how you learn another language. We're going to talk about that and many other things today. So let's start off with a little question. And you can see the question on the screen now. It says, my language is different. Should we think in English? There's a big idea in language teaching and in students and teachers. People talk about this. Everyone wants to think in English. So what do you think about that? Do you think that we need to think in English? Will that really help you, do you think? Let's talk about it. So how do we actually learn a language? What's the difference between learning a language and learning anything? What things do we learn? We could learn how to cook, how to do sport, how to play guitar, how to do martial arts. We could learn philosophy, maths, biology. Is learning a language the same as those things, or is it different? Is it just like learning boxing or learning to cook? Are these things the same? What do you think? Is learning a language special? Is there some particular reason why learning a language is different? Or is it the same? Hello to everybody in the chat, by the way. Hello to Sanjan, Asmina, Julia, Romelia, Anawat, Kamran from Azerbaijan. Hello, Kamran. Good to see you again. Hello to Jose. Jose says, I have the idea that for those who speak German, it's easier to learn English. I want to talk about that later, Jose. So remind me about that later, because I have some interesting ideas to talk to you about on that. Pachu says that learning a language needs a basic method. What do you mean, Pachu? Because learning boxing needs a method. Have you tried to learn boxing without a method? It's very difficult to learn anything without a method, isn't it? You need a method. You need a method to learn anything. So, early theorists, people who studied language learning in the 30s and 40s, they suggested that learning a language was like learning other skills. So language is just another skill. We act a certain way, and good things happen, and we feel good, and we do that more. Or we act a certain way, and we don't get what we want, so we do that less. Very simple. So this was the area of behaviorism. And one of the main thinkers in early behaviorism, in language teaching, a guy called Bloomfield, there he is. And in 1933, he argued that children learn languages by receiving positive and negative responses. That's what he thought. So, mummy give cookie gets a positive response, but mummy gets no positive response. So the baby learns to say, mummy give cookie. That was the idea of Bloomfield in the 1930s. And so we had this idea of behaviorism. It's that simple. You train yourself with positive and negative stimulus, and this causes you to learn the skill of language. That was the belief. But really, is it that simple? Is it as simple as the carrot and the stick? Does this image capture how we learn languages? Maybe this picture. This picture of the mouse with the cheese and the electric shock, often associated with a guy called B.F. Skinner, academic. He studied behaviorism. He talked about a system called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning means, I'm your teacher. I want you to do something. So, I show you, you do it. If it's good, you get the cheese. If it's bad, you get the electric shock. Bzzz. And then I keep teaching you. And over time, you do the right thing and get the cheese every time. That's a very simplified version of operant conditioning. So what do you guys think? Do I need to have my electric shock button here on my desk? When you say something in the chat that's not correct English, I just press it. Bzzz. Shimi, you didn't use a capital letter. Bzzz. Oh, that's a nice conditional, Manuel. Cheese. Well, thankfully, we don't do that. And actually, we have moved on from these early ideas on language learning. Well, at least the academics have moved on from these ideas. Unfortunately, you still see these ideas in classrooms, especially in government education systems around the world. And sometimes quite literally, unfortunately, in classroom situations where corporal punishment is used. Corporal punishment means physical punishment used on students, which obviously modern teachers are completely against, in the West at least. Really, any kind of punishment is not very useful and perhaps damaging. But certainly physical punishment is quite a terrible thing, in the opinion of Western teachers and myself, of course. Right. So what do you think? Let's have a look at these statements, and I'd like you to tell me, do you agree? What's your opinion? Let's talk about that. So learning a language is just like learning a sport like tennis. Good things are reinforced, negative things are avoided. What do you think, everybody? Do you agree with that? Do you think language learning is like tennis? Julia says, learning language needs a tenacious effort and a plethora of dedication and commitment, more often than not. Thank you, Julia. I think that's a piece of cheese for you. Cheese. Send cheese to Julia. Dung. And Romelia says stick and carrot method. This is Romelia's preferred method. Jose says it's not the same. Why is it not the same though, Jose? Why not? What's different? Apart from the obvious thing that we're moving our mouth and sound comes out and then we focus on our ears and we listen for sounds. Little difference. I mean, actually, you do these things in sports as well, right? Like if you play football, you say things like free, 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 or go to, pass, pass, shoot, shoot, right? People say this. So we use this skill also in football. But for some reason, learning football and learning to speak English, learning to communicate in English seem different. Why is that? So Shimi says that motor skills are different. Is that true, Shimi? So it's all about motor skills. So what about comparing learning English to learning chess? Is it the same kind of process to become a master of chess as it is to become a master of English? Is that more what you think, Shimi? Like mental skills instead of motor skills? Emmanuel says both are correct. As a rule, were I to learn a language without good vibrations, I wouldn't do it anymore. So Manuel jumping straight to the Rich Nolan engagement hypothesis. That's 2025. That's coming out next year. My engagement hypothesis. Languages are learned when students are happy. I'll be publishing my paper next year. Look out for that. Sanjan says, I believe learning a language requires a lot of effort and dedication. It needs practice. So in a way, it's not so different from other skills. And actually, I think everyone would agree with some of the things or most of the things that you're saying there, Sanjam. Of course, it requires effort, dedication, and practice. That's for sure. So we can, of course, see some similarities. However, the question here is it just like? And that word just is doing quite a bit of lifting there, isn't it? Is it just like, as in exactly like? And learning how to play tennis seems to be fun. Yeah, well, learning languages should be fun, in my opinion. Again, we've got Pallavi suggesting about the physical, mental part. So let's move on. Is it harder to learn different languages? So after we had the behaviorists talking about conditioning as a way to learn skills, and they applied it to languages as well, some people started to notice that perhaps some languages seemed more difficult to learn for some speakers of other languages. And so they came up with this idea, which was about how different the languages are. So this is from a guy called Robert Lado. You can see him there. I'm not sure if it's Lado or Lado. This was the 1950s. And his idea, or his theory, was called contrastive analysis. So the idea of contrastive analysis is that we take two languages and we compare those languages, And the more similar they are, the easier it is for the speaker of one language to learn the other. And the more different they are, the more difficult it is. So this was the idea of contrastive analysis. And on top of this idea, we got these ideas of positive and negative transfer. Have you heard of that? So positive transfer is when you see a word, for example, in English, and it's similar to a word in your own language. And so you go, I know that word already from my language. That's positive transfer. So we may have an example of government and gobierno in Spanish. Sorry to always use Spanish. It's the language I'm familiar with. I suppose we can look at German. In English, we have is, and in German, ist. So is, ist, very similar. And so we think, oh, I know what is means. It's like ist. And in German, we have was. In English, what. Was, what. Very similar. So was ist, what is. Oh, okay. This seems okay, right? Very similar. So that's called positive transfer. And then we have this idea called negative transfer. Again, this is from the 1950s that we're talking about here. So negative transfer is when there's something in your language and it causes you, or you think it causes you, to make a mistake in the other language. This is negative transfer. It's also called L1 interference. That's native language interference. So this could be, for example, when Manuel, sorry to use you all the time, Manuel, but you're just so good for examples, says the people instead of people. Because in Spanish, you almost always say la gente, la gente, la gente, la gente. But in English, we don't say the people, we say people. And this would be an example of negative transfer when you think an error comes from your own language. So this was all coming from the theory in the 1950s of contrastive analysis. So let's just think about that a moment. Let's have a look at this. What do you think? Most errors that we make when learning a language are due to our native language. For example, a German speaker often makes errors because they think in German. What do you think about that? Do you think the reason that you make errors is because of your native language? Do you agree with that idea? By the way, if you are joining us for the first time, then do take a moment to smash that like button and hit subscribe. I stream on Saturdays, although I am probably going to change my schedule very soon, so look out for that. So Pachu says, yes, native language makes error. So Pachu, you are agreeing with the idea of contrastive analysis from the 1950s. Do we have any other comments about this before we progress? Plavi says, yes, it could be, because all languages have different sentence structure and intonation. So yet you're going from contrastive analysis again, the idea that our first language is this very important thing that's kind of in our mind. And when we learn another language, we always come from our native language. Shimi says, if they're thinking in their native language, and that means they're translating, so yes, they might make errors, or languages don't follow the same sentence rules. Again, we're thinking in a contrastive analysis framework there. And Jose says, I agree. The way that we communicate in our native language makes us make mistakes. All right. Or maybe not. Thank you, by the way, Jose, for that comment, because you have perfectly set me up. Let's just read Jose's comment again. He says, I agree. The way that we communicate in our native language makes us to make mistakes. I am sorry to pick on you, Jose, but it's just a perfect example. Maybe not. So, this is a study from Delay and Burt, and this is in the 1970s. And this study they looked at all of the errors that language learning children made, not in their native language, but in their L2. So this, for example, would be Spanish. In fact, I think it was Spanish children learning English. And we have a very interesting finding here. This is a picture of the lady, by the way, who did this study. We have a very interesting idea here. We see that that errors caused by interference are very small. So most errors in children learning another language did not come from their native language. In fact, only 5% of their errors came from their native language. 87% of them were developmental. And when I say developmental, I mean they're the kind of errors that native speakers make when they learn a language. And then we have this category on the right, which is errors which are neither interference nor developmental. Call those unique, as in you have a particular learner who makes an error that no one else makes, so we don't know how to categorize it. But it is clear from this that with children, at least, learning another language, it is not their native language which causes them to make errors. And these results have been repeated with speakers of different languages and learners of different languages. So it's nothing unique about English, and it's nothing unique about Spanish. But in fact, we can generalize. So it was Delay and Burt. They showed that interference from a native language is not the cause of most errors in a second language. However, is this only true for children? What do you think? Does the same thing apply to adults? Or is this just for children? What do you think? Plawi says, how do you stop thinking in our first language? It's an impossible thing. Maybe only if we move to another country. Just to jump out of my lecture here for a moment, Pallavi, and respond to that, my perspective on this is that thinking in another language is something which happens to you. It's not something that you do. And it's not necessarily something which will be it could be facilitated by moving to another country, but it's certainly not something which relies on you moving to another country. In addition, it's not something which will necessarily happen if you do move to another country. I lived in Spain for 9 years. And I thought in Spanish sometimes, but rarely. Rarely. I know that if I ask people who've lived in England for many, many years, in my experience, few of them will say that they think in English most of the time. They might think in English sometimes, but not most of the time. Of course, this is anecdotal. Pachu says it's not entirely for children. And Ranit says that it's the same for adults in their opinion. And Pallavi says, I don't understand that point. So, we move forward from this to one of the most famous people in this area. And you've probably heard of him. He basically said, languages are acquired, not learned. Just read that again to take it in. It's quite a statement. And I am paraphrasing. He said, languages are acquired, not learned. We do not learn languages, we acquire them. This was the outrageous and incredibly influential claim of Mr. Stephen Crashion. Probably one of the most famous linguists in the world, certainly the most famous theorist of second language acquisition. So Crashion claimed a number of things. This was in the late 1970s. Actually, he began claiming these things in the early 1970s, but they became very famous in the late 1970s. He said that there is a dichotomy in language learning. That means two options only. Either they are acquired through listening to comprehensible input, or they are learned through active study. So either you acquire your language by listening to things that you understand and then talking to people. Actually, he didn't say the talking part. He just said the listening part. Or you study them. And he then said, studying them doesn't help at all in speaking. I'll say that again. Stephen Crashion said, studying languages doesn't help at all in speaking. He said that studying languages doesn't help at all in speaking. He said that studying languages only enables us to monitor ourselves for errors and correct. So if we study the grammar or we study even vocabulary, then that would allow us to monitor and correct ourselves. But according to Crashion, it doesn't help at all in speaking. That's what he said. So Crashion is very, very famous for his hypotheses. Hypotheses is the plural of hypothesis. And by the way, hypotheses and a hypothesis is basically a fancy academic word to mean guess. It's a guess. So, this is Crashion's guess. Crashion's guesses. First, he said this dichotomy. Two options. You can acquire a language by listening to it and understanding it, or you can learn a language by studying. Then he came up with his input hypothesis, which says language learners need to listen to comprehensible input, which is slightly more difficult than their current level. So if you're very basic, then you need to listen to elementary. And if you're elementary, you listen to pre-intermediate. And if you're pre-intermediate, you listen to intermediate. And by doing that, you acquire the language. That's Crashion's input hypothesis. He also had this rather interesting hypothesis called the affective filter hypothesis. So the affective filter is very interesting. It's something we still talk about today. Affective here means emotional. So you notice it's affective with an A at the start, not with an E at the start. Affective, not effective. So affective filter. What this means is, if we feel worried or stressed or negative, then we can't learn, or at least it's very difficult to learn. And the more negative we feel, the more difficult it is to learn. So the affective filter hypothesis basically says learners need to feel as positive as possible in order to learn. And so from that, we can say all kinds of things about the classes should be interesting, the classroom should be relaxing, the students should be happy, and so on. The teacher shouldn't do things which causes their students distress. Obviously, that's negative, that's against the affective filter. So we have this affective filter hypothesis. Then we have two more hypotheses, which I'm going to tell you right now I don't particularly agree with. The first is called the natural order hypothesis. So the natural order hypothesis is that there is a natural order to learning a language, and no matter what you do in the classroom, students will learn the natural order of the language. So you can try to teach someone the past perfect continuous, but if they're not ready to learn it, if they're not there in the natural order, then they can't learn it. It's impossible. So, for example, if we talked about the mistake of saying the people instead of people, according to Crashion, the reason why Manuel hasn't learned that or still makes the mistake the people is that he just hasn't reached that natural order of progression yet. There's something else he needs to learn first. Who knows what that is? But that's what Crashion basically says. So it doesn't matter what the teacher does, they can't change it. It's all about the student. That's why also people like this, that it's very student-centric. We're focusing on the student. But as I've said, I'm not that keen on the natural order hypothesis. And then finally, we have the monitor hypothesis. And you'll have to give me a moment because I need to reference this. So, the monitor hypothesis is something which I also don't particularly agree with. So, the monitor hypothesis says, this is what I said before, everything you say in your second language comes from language you have acquired. Anything you learn in a second language can only be used to monitor or check your speaking or your production. So that's the thing I said before, the monitor hypothesis, that if you learn something in a language, for example, by studying it, then you can't use that to produce anything. And if you can produce something in another language, that's because you've acquired it, not learnt it. That's what Crashion says. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. But that's what he said. So they're his 5 hypotheses. Now, we're going to take a moment to do a quick vocabulary check. Have you been paying attention? On the left there, we have 5 terms from the lecture today. They are acquisition, learning, affective, dichotomy, and hypothesis. And on the right side, we have simple synonyms of those terms. So I'd like you to try and match those fancy academic terms on the left with the more simple terms on the right. 1 to 5, you can match them with A to E, and you can type your answers in the chat, or if you're watching this video later, grab yourself a pen and a notepad and write your answers down. In the meantime, let's just have a look at this comment from Pachu. Pachu says, I now feel that languages are required. This kind of idea came in my mind many years ago, but now I think I have to receive languages, which is native speakers are speaking or writing. I mean, that's another issue, actually, Pachu, which is the idea that when you're acquiring a language, does it need to be natives who you listen to? Actually, according to Crashion, or at least according to the theory, that's not necessarily the case. Because remember, the case is that you have to hear comprehensible input. And actually, it might be more comprehensible for you at your level to understand another language learner rather than a native speaker. So, for example, if you're learning French and your level is A1, then perhaps you could learn quite a lot by listening to an A2 speaker of French, for example. We got some answers coming in here. Seems like on the whole people agree. So here's your answers. Acquisition means gain. Learning is, in this case, study. Affective means emotional. It involves emotion. The affective filter basically means if you have a lot of negative emotion, it's difficult to learn things. Dichotomy means there are only 2 possibilities. Di is a Greek prefix, which means 2. So dichotomy, 2 possibilities. And then hypothesis, which is a scientific or academic guess. Now, I said before, Crashion is a bit of a rock star in language learning. Teachers love him. They love Crashion. But here's a question for you. Why do teachers like Crashion's theories? What do you think about that? Why do people like this? Is it because teachers don't want to teach grammar? Is it because it means that students have to do all the work and teachers can relax while their students acquire languages? Why do you think that teachers like Crashion's theories? Why is Crashion so popular? He really is probably the most popular, definitely the most popular SLA academic, second language acquisition, and he's one of the most popular linguists in the world, maybe second only to Noam Chomsky. Chomsky obviously is ultra famous. I don't know if you guys know Noam Chomsky. He's very, very famous, but second to him would be Stephen Crashion. Well, that's a very interesting point, Pallavi, but we can make another point. For example, when I'm studying a course and I have to do academic writing, then I notice my writing gets very good, my academic writing in English. But if I stop doing that, then I notice my writing gets worse. I stop using the fancy academic words. So actually, this happens to native speakers in their own country who aren't particularly engaging in a specific context. So it's certainly not limited to language learners, the thing that you're talking about. And you might also look at the way you speak. If you spend a lot of time hanging around your university friends, then you might speak a certain way. But if you spend a lot of time hanging around with your family, then you might speak another way. Jose says that teachers only guide and expose students to the language. That is essentially the methodology which comes out of Crashion's hypotheses. Before you fly, you need to learn to walk. Yes, but what does that mean, Manuel? What is flying and what's walking in this analogy? It's very interesting you should say that, Manuel. Manuel said dichotomy and duality could have the same meaning. This is actually something which I was pondering recently as I was writing a piece of academic work, and I was considering myself whether dichotomy and duality do have the same meaning. Naturally, I think they do to some extent. I think there is a crossover there with duality and dichotomy. The thing is that dichotomy makes the implication that we need to go one way or the other. However, duality has a suggestion that both are possible at the same time, although seemingly impossible. The idea of something which is both black and white in the same place at the same time. Okay, we're getting a bit philosophical. Let's move on. So, people have commented on this, especially second language acquisition scholars have commented on teachers liking Crashion. Perhaps they're a little bit jealous that Crashion got the spotlight. And they came up with quite a few explanations, but specifically, one explanation is that it makes teachers' lives easy. So this is from a scholar called Kevin Gregg, and this is a direct quote. He said, "You do not have to know very much to be a good teacher." And he said that's why teachers like it. Because if we accept that Crashion is the way forward, then we don't need to do anything. It's nice and easy to be a teacher if Crashion's theories are correct. And Kevin Gregg says that's why teachers like it, because it gives them a nice, easy time. And then, of course, the other possibility is that it genuinely matches what teachers see in the classroom. In other words, what do we see in the classroom? Well, let me tell you about two examples of students we see in the classroom. One thing we see in the classroom is we do 20 classes on the present perfect, but the students still don't use it correctly when they speak. So we study it and study it and study it and study it and do loads of classes on it, and we say it a million times, and for some reason 40% of the students in the class still make mistakes. They still say he have. They still say I has going. They still use the present perfect when they should use the past simple. So they still make all these mistakes, even though we studied it loads. And of course, this would indicate maybe that Crashion's ideas are correct. And the other thing we see, which is very interesting, and you see this quite a bit as well, I would say about 10 to 15% of students seem to be very much like this. We see students that can use the present perfect, no problem. Actually, they can use it in conversation and writing, no problem. But if you ask them to explain when to use it, they have no idea. And if you ask them to explain how it works, they don't know. In fact, sometimes they don't even know that it's called the present perfect. They just use it. And I am talking about second language learners here, and I am including adults and even older adults. This is not necessarily about children or people who are of a certain age. This can be anyone. That they can use something and they know it's correct and they know that something else is wrong, but they don't know why. They don't actually know the studied grammar, but they can do it. So teachers see this quite a lot in their classrooms. And when we see that, of course, Crashion's hypotheses are quite appealing because they seem to, in fact, they do explain this. They give a good explanation that teachers can go, that's why. That's why. That's why we can study the present perfect again and again and again, and students will still misuse it. On the other hand, that's why I have one student who's making second conditionals, and we haven't even studied conditionals yet, and they don't know what a conditional is, but they can use it fine. So, two possibilities. Either we have lazy teachers looking for an easy life, or we have teachers are seeing this situation really in the classroom. So that was Crashion. Now, the questions that we move on from here with is what's happened since then? Because, Crashion's theories are quite old. This is the 1970s. That's 50 years ago. So what's happened since then? Well, some things have happened since then, actually. You might not know it because Crashion's such a rock star. It's like the Elvis Presley of second language acquisition. People are still listening to Elvis, but some people have made more music since then. So we might ask, are Crashion's theories too simple? Do Crashion's theories really explain the full picture? Because there's something I said before that you might consider maybe that's not quite the case. So before, I said this idea that when you study something, you can't then produce it, according to Crashion. But of course, that's not the case, is it? Surely that's not the case. If you sit down and study something in another language and you try and use it, you can say it, right? You can use it. Maybe you make some mistakes, but you can use it. So studying a language must have some value. It can't be valueless. That doesn't make sense. Study does seem to help in some way. Crashion says it doesn't. It only helps with monitor and self-correction. That's what Crashion says. But we don't see that. We see more than that. We see that study actually, and in fact, I can tell you now, anecdotally in my experience, that students who study a lot actually tend to have very good vocabulary, and they tend actually to be good language learners. So academic students actually can often learn quite well. So there's obviously more to it. So this takes us on to a more modern theory, which is the IIO, or the Input Interaction Output Model. And this comes from Susan Goss. There she is. And Susan Goss basically says, yes, input, and that's very similar to Crashion's idea, the input hypothesis. So we need this comprehensible input. That's the starting point. And another way of getting comprehensible input is through study. When you study another language, you do get comprehensible input. So by studying grammar, in fact, you do get comprehensible input. And then Susan Goss says the next phase is interaction. So we get the input, we study, and then we interact. That is, that we talk to people. So with this input, we talk to people, and when we're communicating in another language, we get all kinds of complicated things going on. We say things, we make mistakes, someone understands, someone doesn't mind, bum, 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 bum. And we get this huge development, and then one day we will get the kind of output we really want. Also, there's the idea that when we use output, when we speak things, that is also part of our learning. So that when I've learned something through input and interaction, and then I write it, or then I speak to someone else, this contributes to the whole process of learning a language. So this is the IIO, the input, interaction, output model. And someone who come up with a very similar idea, which also integrates with this, is Meryl Swain. And she came up with the idea of the output hypothesis, which was deliberately intended to be a response to Crashion's input hypothesis. So input hypothesis, output hypothesis. The idea there is we need comprehensible input to learn to acquire the language, and also we need comprehensible output. In other words, we need to use the language in a meaningful way. So we have this meaningful listening and then meaningful speaking. And these two things together are what cause us to acquire and integrate our language learning. So, quite a lot to think about there, folks. That brings us to the end of our little lecture on second language acquisition. I hope you've enjoyed that today. Quite a lot of fancy academic language coming out. We now have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have any questions right now about language learning or about learning in general or today's class, you can type those in the chat and I will do my best to answer those questions. I think I basically agree with what you're saying there, Manuel, yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Pallavi. I 100% am. I can understand Hindi, but I can't speak it. That's super interesting. So that would indicate that there's something wrong with the input hypothesis. So maybe this is where we need the output hypothesis, Gus. The thing is, can you speak some things, Gus? That's the thing. Because maybe you can understand a lot of Hindi and you can speak some. And the other thing is, maybe you are primed to be able to learn it now. So if you actually went to India and spent 6 months there, maybe you'd be a fluent speaker in 6 months because you already have it all there. You know, it's ready to go. So in other words, you have acquired the language. In Crashion's model, he would say, you've acquired the language. All you need now is to go to India, and in 6 months, you'll be a fluent speaker. Why are Scandinavians so good at speaking English? I can understand them easily. It's an interesting question, Anawat. So, first of all, non-natives find other non-natives easier to understand than natives. That's normally the case. So, first of all, there's that. Second of all, Scandinavians have very kind of sharp vowel sounds in their language, very Germanic. So they tend to pronounce everything quite strongly. So I guess that would make it quite easy for them to, or easy to understand them, because they kind of speak in a kind of strong Scandinavian way. I'm just guessing, really, to be honest, Anna. They are very good at speaking it, though. Yeah, that's right, Manuel. I mean, it's integrated into their culture, and in addition, they don't often use dubbing or voiceovers when they're watching films. they will normally watch films in the native English language, so they get a lot of comprehensible input. Well, that's interesting there, Pachu. I wasn't aware that they were also syllable timed. Actually, we're not syllable timed. We're stress timed language. A stress timed language. By the way, the theory that talks about stress timed languages is very controversial and has undergone some criticism because we find actually to some extent all languages are stress timed and syllable timed. They're both, but it's kind of a spectrum, and English is more stress timed, whereas other languages like the Latin languages are more syllable timed. Some people have a better sense of language. So this is one thing we didn't talk about a lot, which is the kind of psychology of learning, the psychology of learners. So which learners can learn things quicker? And that is something important, by the way. And in very early research in the 1930s, there was a suggestion that the most important consideration for a teacher was identifying students who had the best ability to learn languages. So the focus there was very much on who has the ability to learn languages well, and forget everything else and forget everyone else. We'll just focus on the ones who have the talent. So that was their very early research in the 1930s. And since then, obviously, research has gone away from that kind of elitist idea. However, obviously, there is something in it, because some people are very good learners of language and some people less so. But it's a very complicated issue because you have to consider individual history, other skills people have, if they have other languages, how similar the languages are, cultural issues, the age of the person, what their IQ is, perhaps. There's all kinds of things we can consider. Renit says, I understand Italian languages and I used to speak a little, but since I started learning English, I find it difficult to speak any words in Italian. That's kind of interesting, Granny. And it might just be that you're a little out of practice. You know, something that might be quite interesting for you to do is to take a break from English for like a month and go back to your Italian for a month and then come back to your English and see if your English gets better. Because I'm a real believer that the more kind of languages you learn, the better it is. So you might feel like your Italian has been damaged, but I don't think so. I think if you go back, it will come back. And then when you come back to English, you may even have some positive interaction there. Pallavi, I try to avoid using any kind of social media, actually. I'm allergic to it. Patrick said this is due to a transition from one language to another, meaning thinking in English. So that's the idea of interference, as I expressed before, Pachu. I know it says, why the French can't speak English fluently, even though they share a lot of vocabulary. Well, there's a cultural thing going on there, Anawat. French people don't really like to learn English. And I think I'll just leave that conversation right there. Pallavi says, dangerous? I mean, it can be dangerous, but really, I think that there is a lot of evil that comes from social media, to put it strongly. I think that it can be very damaging for people. I think it's damaging for people psychologically, both in terms of how addictive it is and also the negative influences that you can find on there, and also that you become easy to predict and your data's all out there. I would really encourage people not to use public social media. Private social media is okay. WhatsApp, for example, could be okay, but I would avoid using things like Instagram and Facebook unless you're using it for a business. But I think there's a lot of negative things that come out of that. And personally, I try to avoid it as much as possible now, only when I really need to, especially things like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. I think they're really, it's just my opinion, but I think they're poisonous. Shimi says, interestingly, English words are often used when speaking Hindi, and I noticed it in being in the Tamil language. I think that's probably because of the colonial history in India, Shimi. On top of the fact that English is a global language, and so kind of everything everything is influenced by English at the moment. Yeah, thanks for that, Pallavi. I suppose my argument here would be social media is addictive, but also encourages negative social psychology. And also, I don't enjoy social media at all. Whereas other things which are addictive, I think can be therapeutic and don't necessarily need to be negative. For example, if you get addicted to exercise, maybe there are some negative connotations from the fact that I use the term addiction. However, let's be clear, there are worse things to be addicted to than exercise, for example. And then perhaps we consider playing chess. If someone's addicted to playing chess, is that necessarily negative? Could be a little bit, but maybe not so negative. On the other hand, if someone's addicted to TikTok and they spend 5 hours a day on TikTok, I think that's going to cause a lot of problems. Manuel uses the autodidactic method in Italian, subtitles in English. Listening in Italian, subtitles in English. Cool. See, that sounds fun to me, Manuel. Maybe I should try learning Vietnamese in Spanish. That could be quite fun. Manuel says, I'm a beeraholic, coffeeaholic, sportaholic, readaholic. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name has been ProfRich. I'll make sure that I get the notes down below the video later. Patrick says, do Americans use higher difficult words than other English-speaking people? No, certainly not. Probably British people are known for using the fanciest vocabulary. However, that is a generalization which relies heavily on the aristocracy and the upper class and highly educated British people. I think that in general, we all, there are people who speak very well and people who don't speak very well. And it doesn't really matter what language they speak or what country they are from. But certainly I wouldn't say that Americans use fancier vocabulary than British people. I've never particularly thought that. I don't think there's much of a perception of that as well. I'm not sure that there's anything that we can't be addicted to, Pallavi. You can probably get addicted to anything. However, I think it's well worth considering what effect it has on your psychology and your mind, because things that are addictive will create behaviors in you. And the question is, what do you want those behaviors to be? And one of the things about social media is, I think that you often look at other people's lives and photos and stuff, and you start to compare yourself to what other people have, even though those photos don't really show the true picture. And so we get this kind of negative psychology going on, which I don't think is psychologically healthy. That's why I would avoid it. according to today's approach to learning, is that timing of repetition is very important. Well, we didn't talk about repetition actually, but repetition goes back to behaviorism and operant conditioning, which was Skinner in the 1930s. I talked about it right at the start of the class. I'll do my best, Gus. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much, Sanjan. And thank you very much, everybody else, for joining me today. Have a lovely weekend, and I will see you next week.